Today's daf is daf Tes Vav, and we begin with the Mishnah on Yudalid Amud Beis, which is 5 lines up before the end of the Amud, and we're talking about Pigul, and specifically about what's called the Kivsei Atzeres. There are two kvasim that are brought on Chag HaShavuos, and they are matir the Shtel Lechem. We're also talking about the bazichin that accompany the lechem aponim, which are matir the achila of the lechem aponim. Nitmeis achas min achalos o echad min asdorim. Now let's just talk about chalos for a moment. On Shavuos, as we said before, we bring these two kvasim, and their avoda will be matir the shtel lechem. And now, one of the two lechamim, one of the two of the shtel lechem got contaminated, let's say, by a sheretz. Or alternatively, we have two starim. What does starim mean? The lechem aponim was arranged 6 lechamim, one on top of the other, and another 6 lechamim, one on top of the other. These are two starim, and one of the starim came in contact with tumah and became tameh. So now the question is whether or not the tumah on one of the two lechamim of the shtel lechem, or on one of the two starim of the lechem aponim, now impacts on the other one. The other one is tahar. But nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Shneim Yetzu Lebeis Hasreifa. Both lechamim, or both starim, are completely disqualified and must be taken out to the Beis Hasreifa and burnt with psulei hamukdashim. And the possibility exists that the reason for Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is because he has some sort of a limitation, which we'll explain later on, a limitation in the power of the tzitz. The tzitz, which was worn on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol, had a power to be mitayr a carbon, which is technically and in reality tameh. But that's not what the Mishnah says. That's going to be a sugya in the Gemara. But the Mishnah says that the reason for Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is because she'ein carbon tzibur cholok. In other words, that when you have a carbon tzibur, which is true both in the case of the kivsei atzeres and in the case of the lechem aponim, then ein cholok. We don't divide it into parts. Whatever happens to half happens to the whole, and therefore the tumah now is applicable to the other lechem of the shtel lechem and to the other seder of the lechem aponim. Chacham omrim hatame betum aso vatar yeachel. That which contracted tumah has to be burnt, and that which did not contract tumah does not have to be burnt, which means that the Chachamim never had this principle of ein carbon tzibur cholok. Omar Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Lazar, the Gemara wants to limit the machlokas. Machlokas lifnei zrika, v'liachar zrika divrei hakol atomi b'tumos v'ator yoyachel. Rabbi Yehuda would agree that if the zrika was done, then the zrika is matir, that loaf, that lechem, which is tar. Or in the case of the lechem aponim, the shnei bazichin are matir, that lechem, or seder we'll call it, which is tar. Rabbi Yehuda's objection is before zrika. Once the zrika was implemented, then the carbon is fixed as a carbon kosher, at least as far as the tar is concerned. Rabbi Yehuda's point is that before Zrika, the Zrika doesn't have the power to be matir choluk. Choluk meaning part of the lechamim. It's an all or nothing proposition, which means that according to Rabbi Yehuda, if before Zrika one of the lechamim contracted tumah, then the Zrika itself does not have the power to be matir the lechamim, and therefore the entire set of lechamim is possible. B'toras tameh, b'toras tumah. And we've mentioned many times that Zrika is always the culmination of the avod of a carbon, and that effectuates the ritzui and the kapara of the carbon, and also generates the matir, in this case of the mativ shtel lechem, or the mativ for the lechem upon him. Says Rabbi Yehuda, that Zrika cannot be effective to be matir lechem upon him, because it's an all or nothing proposition, and since one of the lechamim contracted tumah, therefore the Zrika cannot be matir. But says Rabbi Lazar, in a case where the Zrika was already implemented, and the Zrika now is chal to be matir one of the lechamim, then we're not going to undermine and negate that which is already fixed in stone, namely the efficacy of the Zrika to be mechaper meratza on that lechem or that seder that was tar. So the Gemara now asks ulifnei Zrika. Okay, so now we know that the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim in our Mishnah revolves around lifnei Zrika. B'mai pligi. What is the fundamental basis or origin for this machlokas? Amar Papa bitzitz. So we'll see exactly what Rav Papa has in mind. But all the Mefarshim are up in arms here about this statement of Rav Papa, because Rabbi Yehuda, the Mishnah, explicitly is outspoken about the fact that the reason why he holds that the tumah spreads throughout all the lechamim and they all have to be burnt is because ein carbon tzibur choluk. So we don't know exactly how Rav Papa would deal with the Mishnah, which is explicit. Maybe he had a different text in the Mishnah, I don't know. But in any event, Rav Papa is going to insist that the machlokas revolves around the power of the tzitz. B'tzitz meratz al achilos kam miflagi. The machlokas is about the efficacy of the tzitz to be maratza. And starting our daf for today on daf tesvav, Rabbanan Savri atzitz meratza al achilos. Rabbi Yehuda Sover ein atzitz meratza al achilos. So we know that in every carbon, there's a part of the carbon that's nechal, that is eaten. If that part of the carbon that's eaten contracts tumah, there's a machlokas now amongst Tanoim between Chacham and Rabbi Yehuda as to whether or not the tzitz could make that carbon for those parts that are eaten into tar, like magically make them from tameh to tar, such that the carbon was brought petara. And whereas the Rabbanan extend the power of tzitz to include even the nechal, Rabbi Yehuda says no. The tzitz doesn't have the power to convert a nechal, a foodstuff that's already contracted tumah, into something that's tar, because the reality of it is that it's tameh. So therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, the tzitz is only maratza on what's called olin. So again, if I had a whiteboard, I would write the word olin. Olin means that which is burnt on the mizbeach. So that which is burnt on the mizbeach can be considered as if it was tar by virtue of the power of the tzitz. But now we're talking about nechalim, achilos. We're not talking about something that's going on to the mizbeach. And here we have machlokas about the extent of the power of the tzitz. The Rabbanan extended such that the scope of tzitz is even with regard to achilos, that which is eaten by Adam. like for example, the shtel lechem of kivsei atzeres of Shavuos, or the shnei sdarim of lechem aponim, all of which is eaten by the kohen, and half of that became tomei. And the question is whether tzitz is maratza. The chachamim say that tzitz is maratza, making it magically into something that's tar. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says no, tzitz is only maratza for olim, but not for necholim, not for achilos. Amalei Rav Huna. Now, the Gemara is going to pile up 3 arguments to reject Rav Papa. The last one is the one that we mentioned at the outset, that the Mishnah explicitly tells us, reveals to us, why Rabbi Yehuda holds that both lechamim have to be taken out to the base hasreifa. But first we have 2 other objections. One is from Rav Huna Breder Rab Nosson, Vaha olim, that tzitz meratza ala olim. Right, we have no doubt, and there's no debate about the power of the tzitz to be meratza on that which is burnt on the mizbeach, so that if that which is meant to go on the altar contracts tumah, the tzitz is certainly meratza. And again, keep in mind that we're not talking about a case where the Kohen became Tomei, or the Yisrael who's eating the korban became Tomei. Because that, for sure, the tzitz is not maratza on the ochlim. We're talking about whether it's maratza on tumas ochel. The only case where the tzitz is maratza on the ochlim is going to be in the case of a korban tzibur, where most of the tzibur contracted tumah. Like, for example, let's say most of the tzibur were tomei for the korban pesach on Yudalid B'Nisan, then tzitz is maratz. But other than that, on a korban yachid, for an individual who contracted tumah, tzitz is not maratz. But as far as ochlim is concerned, Rav Huna now says that we know that tzitz is maratza on olim, on that which goes on to the mizbeach, and yet upligi. We have a brisa that records machlokes about something that's ola and is burnt on the mizbeach. For example, the bazichin. What happens to the bazichin? Those 2 spoonfuls of levona that accompany the sdarim of the lechem aponim. They have to be burnt on the mizbeach. Now we have 2 bazichin. What happens if one of the 2 bazichin contracts tumah? Is nitma echad min avazichin. We have the same machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chacham. Rabbi Yehuda omer shneim yasu betuma. Lefisha ein korban tzibur chaluk. Right? Rabbi Yehuda holds that the korban tzibur is one entity, which we cannot divide it into its component parts. And therefore, since the tzitz is maratza on olim, in the case of a korban tzibur, it's going to be maratza on all the olim, even those that really don't, because we can't divide it into half, as we said before. Chachamim omrim, on the other hand, that hatame b'tumaso v'atar b'taraso. Now, when we're talking about bazichin, right, and one of the bazichin contracted tumah, and it's olim, then everybody would agree that the tzitz is maratza. And yet, in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda rules that if one of the 2 lechamim contracted tumah, we treat the other lechem as if it contracted tumah as well. And that's because the tzitz, according to Rav Papa's explanation of Yehuda, is not maratza on the second lechem that's tamei. Then in the Brisa's case, which we just have mentioned before, where the tzitz is definitely maratza, how can we allow being mitame that bazich, that spoonful, which is tar? Now the Gemara has another objection to Rav Papa. V'od omer Rav Ashi toshma. We learned in the Brisa. Rabbi Yehuda omer Now we're talking about a case of a korban tzibur where one shevet of the 12 shvatim contracted tumah. Afilu shevet echad tameh, Rabbi Yehuda says, v'chol hashvatim tahorim yasu b'tumah. So we're not talking about a case where most of Klal Yisrael contracted tumah, only most of one shevet contracted tumah. And once again, Rabbi Yehuda is going to apply and activate the power of the tzitz, such that that shevet could bring the korban, because the korban tzibur, she'ein korban tzibur chalak. Again, the same principle that we don't split a korban tzibur. V'hacha mai hatzitz maratza ika. Right, what is the possibility of this tzitz generating ritzui? The tzitz only generates ritzui if you have a korban that's tummy. But here we're talking about, as we said before, the people contracted tumah. And if the people, in this case, the members of that shevet, which have to bring the korban, have contracted tumah, then there's no tzitz maratza. So we see, says Rav Ashi clearly, that Rabbi Yehuda's statement with regard to a korban tzibur that's eino cholok, that we can't divide it up, is totally irrelevant to the issue of ritzui tzitz. And finally, the Gemara objects to Rav Papa, V'yona Amar Avina, Tashma. Let's just read the Mishnah. The Mishnah itself that we're learning now says that nitmeis achas min achalos or achas min asdarim, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shnayim, Shneim Yetzu lebeis asrei. For why? Lefisha ein korban tzibur cholok. So don't tell me it has anything to do with the tzitz. It's obviously irrelevant to the tzitz. It's simply based on the principle that Rabbi Yehuda understood that ein korban tzibur cholok. V'chacham omrim atamid tmosa tar b'tumoso. V'yam isa, according to Rav Papa, lefisha ein hatzitz maratz al achilos miboile. Rabbi Yehuda should have said that the reason why the second lechem has to be yotzi lebeis hasreifa is because the tzitz cannot be maratza on achilos. It only can be maratza on something that's olel gabi mizbeach. Why didn't Rabbi Yehuda mention that? So, as a culmination of all these three objections to Rav Papa, Rabbi Yochanan steps up to the plate and he says, no, Rav Papa is off beat here. That's not the reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda, but rather the reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda is explicit in the Mishnah, Ein Korban Tzibur Choluk, Elam Rav Papa, Limod Aruch Hu Befiv Shel Rabbi Yehuda, Limud. Rabbi Yehuda had a limud that was passed on mouth to mouth, generation to generation. It was a Mesoras HaTorah that Ein Korban Tzibur Choluk. The Rabbanan never had that Mesorah, and therefore they hold that Hatomei B'tumosav HaTorah B'turaso. There's no reason, according to Rabbanan, to be metame the other lechem when only one lechem became tameh. And now we're up to the Mishnah. Now the Mishnah wants to know about a variety of karbonos, the nature of which is that there's the carbon, and then there's something that's added to the carbon. It's like an add-on, and it's impacted by the carbon itself. For example, in a carbon toda, there's the animal itself, the carbon, the behemoth itself, and then there's what's called lachme toda. Lachme toda are 4 different categories of lechamim. Each category has 10 lecham, so it's 40 lechamim all told. And now the question is, when we talk about the zevach of a toda together with its lechamim, wherein lies the halach of pigul? And the Mishnah establishes that a toda mefagelis es halechem, but halechem eino mefagelis hatoda. It's a one-directional road. The toda, if he has a machsheves pigul on the toda, that he will eat the toda liachar zmano, that is mefagel, that generates a chiyuv kares on the lechem itself. So the lechem is dragged into the carbon. However, the other way around, the lechem, which is ancillary, which is secondary to the carbon toda itself, eino mefagelis hatoda. Ketzad shachad es hatoda lechem b'menu lemachar. If he had a machsheves chutz zmano, a machsheves pigul during the shchita of a carbon toda, then that he will eat the korban toda tomorrow, meaning after its time allotment. Then he, the korban toda itself, ve'alechem mefugolim. The the chalos pigel is generated on not only the zevach itself, which he thought to eat tomorrow, but also on the lechamim. But the other way around, if he had a machshava lechem and a lechem lemachar, his machshava was not on the zevach, but rather on the lechem, and he will eat the lechem tomorrow chutz lizmano. Halechem mefugal, of course, the chalos pigel is chal on the lechem, which he had in mind lemachar. But hatoda ain't mefugelis. The pigel of the lechem does not have the power to impact on the toda. And now we move over to the shnei kvasim, the kivsei atzeres of Chag HaShavuos with regard to the shtei lechem, and we have the same principle applied there. Hakvasim, the two kvasim that are brought on Shavuos, mefaglis halechem, but the other way around, the lechem ain't mefaglis hakvasim. Ketzad? If he has in mind the machshavas pigel of chutzes mano at the time of the shechita vis-a-vis the kvasim, then not only him, the kvasim themselves become pigel with the chi of kares, but a lechem efugolim, even the lechem is schlepped along. So there are the two lechamim, the shtei lechem that are brought on Shavuos, and they now become pigel as a result of the machshavas pigel on the shnei kvasim. And that would mean that if somebody would go ahead and eat a kezayis from the shtei lechem, he would incur a chi of kares. If he did a peshogig, he has to bring a korban chatas. But the other way around, lechol es halechem lemachar, if at the time of the shechita he had in mind an intention that the lechem would be eaten chutz lizmano, is then halechem mefugal, v'ha kvasim eina mefugalim. The pigel on the lechem will not impact on the korban itself, on the behema, on the kvasim. My time. The Gemara wants to know, why is it that the pigel on the kvasim, or in the ratio of the pigel on the korban toda, will impact on the lechamim? Ile mishum d'Rav Kahana, if it's simply an application of the rule of Rav Kahana, the Omer of Kahana, minayin lelachmei toda shenikro toda. It's interesting that the Torah, in its expression and its formulation, calls the lechamim of toda toda, where shenemar, because of a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Zayin, it says vehikriv al zevach hatoda chalos. So you see that the Zevach Toda name is related also to the Chalos. The Chalos are called Zevach Toda. So you might say, therefore, that the Lechamim of the Lachmei Toda are part and parcel of the Toda. They have the same name as the Toda, and therefore the Pigel on the Toda automatically is Mefagel, even the Lechem. But you can't say such a thing, because the Hachi Pchanami. Why not apply the same rule in the reverse? If he has machshavas pigel on the achila of the lechamim, it should generate pigel on the kvasim. Why? I'm sorry, not on the kvasim. We're talking about the toda. Sorry, on the toda. Why? Because even the lechamim are called toda. Gemara is not impressed initially by that kasha. Why? Holo kasha. It could be what the Torah is saying is that the lechem, as far as the dinim of the lechem are concerned, are called toda. And that's called lechem ikri toda. But toda lo ikri lechem. The reverse is not true. We're not going to say that the toda is also the lechem. The lechem is not. The lechem is part of the toda in the chumrah, in the strict sense, meaning that now the machshavas pigel on the toda will be chal on the lechem. So in that sense, the lechem is part of the toda and has a name toda. But don't tell me that the toda has a name of lechem in the reverse, because the lechem is secondary. Ella hadiktoni akvasim mefaglis alechem lechem mefaglis akechem lechem hecha ashka de ikri kvasim. Let's say I grant you that it's a one-way street. the lechem is called toda, but the toda is not called lechem. But what are you going to do with the seifa of the Mishnah, where we're talking about the kivsei atzeres of Chag HaShavuos and its impact on the lechamim? So, according to your logic, the only reason, as we saw in Lachmei Toda, that the pigel on the Toda is chal to be mafagel the lechem is because the lechem is also called Toda. Then, by virtue of the same logic, you're going to have to show me that lechem heicha ashka dikri kvasim, that somewhere in the Torah the lechem of shtei lechem is called kvasim, and that's impossible. So therefore, we have to go back to the drawing board. Hainu time of the reason why the pigel on the toda is chal also on the lechem, and the lechem now is chayiv kares mishum pigel, because lechem glal toda. The lechem is brought because it's what we call in Yiddish a noch schlepper, right? It's schlepped along with the toda. It's ancillary to the toda. But ain't toda glal lechem. We wouldn't say that the toda is brought as an attachment, as a tag onto the lechem. And the same thing is going to apply now to the kivsei atzeres. It's a one-way street. Lechem glal kvasim, meaning the red of the shtei lechem is sort of secondary to the kvasim. V'eina kvasim glal lechem utzrichi. Now the Gemara wants to know, why did the Mishnah feel compelled to bring both cases? Case number one was the case of Toda with Lachmei Toda. The case number two was the Shnei Kvasim with the Shtei Lechem. Why was it necessary? The principle is identical in both cases. Tzrich, we need both. Diashmin and Toda, if we only had the case of Toda, and the Mishnah would tell me that the Toda is mafagel, the lechem, hasam hudachim mafagel b'lechem lo mafagel b'toda. Let's go the other way around. Let's say he had machshavas pigel on the lechem, and would that in any way impact and expand the scope of the pigel to be chal on the toda itself? We said no. We don't really have any active pu'ula relationship between Lachmei Toda and the Toda, because there's no tnufa. Let's explain. There's a havamina that in the case of the Shtei Lechem, the Shtei Lechem are so much a part of the kvasim that the machshavas pigel of the Shtei Lechem would impact and expand pigel to the kvasim. And what would lead me to that conclusion that the Shtei Lechem are part and parcel of the Shnei Kvasim is the fact that we require Tnufa. They had to take the Shtei Lechem together with the Kvasim, and they had to wave them together in all 6 directions. So that might give me a clue as to say that the Lechem, in the case of Shtei Lechem, in the Shnei Kvasim, is really part and parcel of the kvasim, and therefore the machshavas pigel on the lechem to eat a chutz lizmano would generate pigel even on the kvasim. But in the case of Lachmei Toda, the Lachmei Toda are not subject to tnufa, to waving together with the korban Toda, and therefore why would I even dream that the machshava on the lechem in the case of Toda, the Lachmei Toda, which is Glal HaToda, would in any way impact and generate pigel on the Toda itself. Now, the strange thing, as Rashi points out, is that the Gemara doesn't go the other way around. The Gemara never explains why it wouldn't be enough to tell me the Seifa in the case of Shnei Kvasim, and we're going to say with the Kal Vachomer, if in the case of the Shnei Kvasim, where there is Tnufa with the Shtei Lechem, and yet the Machshavas Pigel on the Shtei Lechem does not impact on the Kvasim, then how much more so in the case of Toda, where there's no Tnufa of the Lechem and the Lachmei Toda together with the Toda, for sure the Pigel, Machshavas Pigel of the Lachmei Toda would not impact on the Toda itself. That was Rashi's question. Boy minei Rabbi Elazar mirav. Okay, the names are important here, so let's keep it in mind that Rabbi Elazar is talking to Rav, and he asks him the following question: Hashocheres hatoda lechol kezayis mimena umilachma lemocher mahu. He shechted the carbon toda, and his intention was, and this is a declaration he made at the time of the shechita, that he's going to eat a kezayis that's made up of a combination of half a zayis of the toda, meaning of the behemoth, the meat itself, and half a zayis of one of the lachmei toda, and that's the kezayis that he's going to eat chutz l'zmano. Le'ipagule toda lo miboile. I have no doubt in my mind, it's pshita, that the Toda itself would not be Pigel in this case, because Hashtal, I'll show you the logic. Kula milachmo lo mifagla. Now, even if he had a Machshavas Pigel on all the Lechamim, way beyond the Kizayis, it would still not have any impact on the Toda itself. Mimeno milachmo miboy. Kika miboyle, what's my suffix, says Rabbi Lozar? Li'ipalgule lechem. Right? Can we be mitzaref his machshava on a chatzi zayis of zevach chutz mano to the chatzi zayis of the lechem? Mi mitzarfa todolaf li'ipalgule lechem olo. Right? We said that the toda is primary, the lechem is secondary. It's schlepped along with the toda. And therefore, I might think that the chalos pigel could be chal on the lachmei toda by virtue of this integration, this combination of his machshevas pigel of a half a kizayis on the zevach, on the toda, and that would be integrated with the chatzis, with the machshevas pigel on the chatzi zayis of the lechem. And the reason for this is because since the lachmei toda are really glal hatoda, meaning they are sort of like secondary and swallowed up to the toda, therefore we can integrate the chatzi zayis in his machshava on the toda with his chatzi zayis of machshava chutz mano on the lechem. Amalei, so at this point, Rav turns to Rabbi Elazar and he says to him the following: Af bazu alechem mefugal vatoda ena mefugelis. Right, we're going to be very consistent, and we're going to say that you cannot be mitzarif the machshavas pigel of chatzi zayis of toda together with the chatzi zayis of lechem. They're two separate entities. So Rabbi Elazar rejects it. He says, "Amai." Lema kal v'chomer. Okay, so now we're going to study this kal v'chomer, and that's going to be the subject of the rest of today's study. What is the kal v'chomer of Rabbi Elazar to reject Rav and to say that the lechem is not mefugal? So before we see it inside, if I have your permission, I would like to just go through the logic together with you, as we say in Yiddish, oisavenik meaning without the text. Just think about it, in luftarein, in the air. Let's see. The machshava of pigul on the lechem cannot impact on the toda itself, and that we know. The toda remains kosher. So we see that the machshavas pigel on the lechem is very, very limited, so to speak. It's very weak. In the reverse situation, meaning where he has a machshavas pigel on the zevach, that's a very powerful machshavas pigel. It even impacts on the lechem and makes the lechem into pigel. So that's, I think, the logic here of this kal v'chomer. Take a look inside now. Lema kal v'chomer uma hamefagel eno mispagel. Right? You want to set up, according to Rav, the possibility that the machshavas pigel on the Toda itself will now integrate with the machshavas pigel on the lechem, right? Because he had like he has a chatzis for each, right? So now it's going to impact on the lechem, and yet you admit that was pshita that the mefagil ain't a mispagil, meaning the machshavas pigel of the Toda does not in any way affect the Toda. The Toda remains kosher. And therefore, haba lefagil v'lo pigil, eino din shelo yispagil. Again, let's go over the logic. If in the case of machshavas pigel on the zevach, which has the power to impact on the lechem, and yet it itself does not become pigel, then how much more so in the case of haba lefagel, right? Because he has a machshavas pigel on the lechem, v'lo pigel, meaning the machshavas pigel on the lechem in its power to impact a pigel on the zevach, on the Toda, is impotent, if you pardon that word. It cannot in any way impact on the Toda. Then for sure it can't impact a pigel on itself. So the Gemara says, "Umi I'm reading kal v'chomer kai gavna v'tanya." We're going to go through a whole sugya now of kilayim, and from kilayim we're going to prove that such a kal v'chomer is not a valid kal v'chomer. And that's where we start with v'hatanya.